budding Fellinis or something. They can make really good programming in this realm and distribute it. Welcome, welcome very, very much to Conversations, where it's a pleasure to welcome to the program Aryeh Neier. He's the president of the Open Society Institute that's headquartered here in New York City and is a long-term watcher and initiator of actions in the name of preserving, safeguarding, and preserving human rights considerations. And Aryeh, welcome really very much to Conversations and to Manhattan Network.
Thanks very much.
We've got a lot to talk about. We met at a conference down at the New School University a while back, but you had an active. I wonder maybe you could you share maybe at a personal level your own personal background, born, raised, educated, something, and then I know you've been in Human Rights Watch and the Open Society, but some of your own personal background, if you could, please.
Okay, I was born in Berlin, Germany in 1937, which was while Hitler was in power. And I left Germany, I left Berlin in 1939, just on the eve of the outbreak of the war. I went to England with my parents. I was too young to remember Germany. The first memory I have, but I'm not even sure if I really remember it, if I've only imagined it or been told about it so often, is of the ship going to England. And I lived in England during the war and for about 3 years after the war, and then came with my parents to the United States and went to high school in the United States, in New York, went to college here, and a few years after college I started working professionally on behalf of rights when I went to work for the American Civil Liberties Union.
Oh boy, okay.
That was in 1963, and I worked for the ACLU for 15 years, and the last 8 years I was the National Executive Director.
Is that the position Ira Glazer's had recently?
Ira Glaser succeeded me, and he left last year. He retired last year.
You got Nadine Strauss in there now?
Nadine is the chair of the board.
I see.
The executive director is Anthony Romero. He's been director since last September. He came on actually, I think, 6 days before September 11.
Really?
So that was quite a moment to take on that post. But after I left, or about the time that I was leaving the ACLU, I was a founder of the organization that became Human Rights Watch. We started with something called Helsinki Watch to deal with abuses in the Soviet Union and in other countries that signed the 1975 Helsinki Accords.
And when was that, the Helsinki Watch started?
We started in 1978.
78, that's where it was,
And then as we began monitoring other regions of the world, as we began monitoring first Latin America, then Asia, then Africa, and then the Middle East, we began using the name Human Rights Watch to indicate that we were global in operation. And I stayed at Human Rights Watch until 1993 and then left to become the president of the Open Society Institute.
I see, where you've been ever since.
I've been there for the last 9 years.
I see. Well, that's ACLU, when did that get started? I mean, what
it got started in 1920.
That's a very important institution.
It got started in 1920. There were actually 2 organizations that existed during World War I that defended the rights of conscientious objectors and people who engaged in protests against the war. And then in 1920, there seemed a need for a permanent organization. Following World War I, we had something called the Palmer Raids, in which Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer and his young assistant, J. Edgar Hoover, organized raids in which they rounded up aliens and people who they thought were left-wingers and jailed a lot of them summarily and deported a few hundred of them to what was called then Soviet Russia. And the ACLU got started in response to things like the Palmer Raids, and its very first court case actually put up to the Palmer Raids.
And it's been doing that ever since?
Ever since. And it's now 82 years.
And to some of the more, conservative people in society, has been a great bane.
It has been a bane
a source of
to
subversive,
conservative
protecting
people.
subversives and so forth.
Although there are occasions when conservatives line up with the ACLU when they see it as defending their rights. It's managed to antagonize almost everyone
Got to be doing
over a
something right,
period
huh?
of time.
Yeah, if you're doing that, you've got to be. I congratulate you for having been involved in that institution and carrying it on. It's really very, very important, and I congratulate you. And the work in the Human Rights Watch is a continuation of that.
It
in a
is.
large
It
sense.
was
There's a similarity between the Human Rights Watch activity and the notions of the ACLU. They're both grounded in law. Are there similarities between
There
those
are
two
similarities. The only major difference is that Human Rights Watch operates worldwide and the ACLU focuses on the United States.
Is there an international element that is comparable on the international scale to the ACLU?
Well,
or is there going to become such, do you think?
in some ways, Human Rights Watch is the closest there is. It can't operate the way the ACLU does. Most of the time, you can't go to court to vindicate rights if you operate internationally. You can sometimes, but
we'll talk about that.
but a lot of the time you cannot.
Yeah.
And so most of the work that Human Rights Watch does consists of investigating abuses and then documenting abuses of human rights and pointing out the discrepancies between the pretenses of various governments to respect rights and their actual practices. Embarrassing governments is most of what Human Rights Watch does, whereas the ACLU, operating in the domestic system, relies on going to court a great deal of the time.
I'm doing that. And one last little thing, the Amnesty International, sister institution.
Amnesty was started in 1961, and it also does most of its work by conducting investigations and documenting abuses and advocating on the basis of the documentation. Amnesty operates somewhat differently from Human Rights Watch. First, its mandate, or its self-defined mandate, is somewhat narrower. Amnesty got started focusing on torture and on the imprisonment of people on grounds of conscience.
Absolutely, writing letters to people and so forth.
Human Rights Watch has a wider mandate, but also its methods are somewhat different. Human Rights Watch got started as an American organization and focused very much on U.S. foreign policy and its impact on other countries. And now it operates globally, but it continues to focus a lot on not only U.S. foreign policy, but European Union foreign policy, and on the foreign policies of other governments, and in that way tries to bring a kind of political pressure to bear on human rights, which is somewhat different from the way in which Amnesty works.
You travel in the same vineyard.
We travel in the same vineyard, and the two organizations are complementary.
I wonder if we could do that, and we do want to get the Open Society. You've got a great deal going on, but I mean, in that realm, we live, some people would say, Reinhold Niebuhr used to say, moral nation, immoral world, and they had an international order that we live in a nation of United Nations of the world. Sovereignty has traditionally been vested at the national level or the state level.
It has been,
and we live we live at the same time, obviously, in a globalizing world where things are becoming closer and closer together. What are the founding documents in the international? I'm not an attorney, neither am I, but it's just sort of as a layman interesting. We have a constitution for our system here that we can repair to, that sort of thing nations do. But what are the founding documents in the realm of the emerging notion of international law? And what is, if I may, what is the role of, because I've always repaired to, as it were, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that Eleanor Roosevelt hammered out along with other people as a founding document to some others. But I wonder if there's some covenants and so forth. Can you fill us in on what the legal structure of the international legal order is coming to be understood?
There are really two sets of documents that are crucial. One is one begins the adoption of the United Nations Charter in 1845, and it commits the United Nations itself to promote human rights, and it commits the member states of the United Nations to promote human rights. And then what was meant by human rights was spelled out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Important document.
A crucial document.
To me it is.
And then after the Declaration was simply something adopted by resolution by the United Nations. So it didn't
Hard
have...
fought.
Yes, but it was adopted without dissent. There were abstentions, abstentions by the Soviet bloc countries, Saudi Arabia, South Africa. The other governments all supported the Universal Declaration. And then after the Universal Declaration, which was only a resolution, it didn't have binding effect, there were some covenants which put into effect what was said in the Declaration. And the most important of these is something called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. But there were also other international agreements that come out of the same period historically. For example, the day before the United Nations adopted the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, it adopted the Genocide Convention, and then various countries ratified the Genocide Convention, so it became a binding treaty.
That was separate from the Declaration?
Separate. And the Genocide Convention was only ratified by the United States in 1988,
really?
40 years after it was adopted by the United Nations.
Don't want to get parenthetical? Why did it take them so long?
In the early years, Southern members of the U.S. Senate feared that the Genocide Convention would somehow be applied to segregation in the United States. So
Malcolm X was bringing the United States up on charges
it was
for the
before
UN for human rights.
Before Malcolm X.
Yeah.
But it was opposed by Southerners in the U.S. Senate, and the Senate has to ratify by a two-thirds majority before a treaty can be adopted by the United States. So it wasn't until Ronald Reagan was president in 1988 that the United States ratified the Genocide Convention. But there's a separate body of law which is becoming of comparable importance, and some would even say of greater importance in protecting international human rights. And it's what's referred to sometimes as international humanitarian law or the laws of war. And starting in the 1860s, countries began agreeing to various ways of limiting the consequences of war, limiting the way in which prisoners were treated, for example. The Geneva Conventions. So the first Geneva Conventions go back to the that period
1860s?
in the 1860s.
And
then the Geneva Conventions were revised a number of times, but starting in 1999, another set of documents was adopted, and in 1899, the Hague Convention was adopted. So there are these conventions adopted at Geneva and at The Hague, which together form the major part of international humanitarian law, or the laws of war.
I see. Was that done by state, or was that done in the name of the League, or how was it?
No, those were done by states, states assembling, and for example, the current version of the Geneva Conventions were adopted in 1949, and they have been adopted by virtually every country in the world. And then in 1977, some additions were drafted for the Geneva Conventions, and most countries have ratified what are called the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions. And these are very important because a lot of the time very serious abuses of human rights take place in the context of armed conflict. And so trying to limit the way in which armies conduct themselves during armed conflict has been very important.
Absolutely.
And so the combination of international humanitarian law, the laws of war, the laws of Geneva and The Hague on the one hand, and the agreements coming out of the adoption of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, those bodies of law coming together are the principal international protection for human rights.
Okay, very good. That's very good. Thank you for that. And I think you said like war. It used to be wars would be fought by the armies in the meadow off on the side or something, but in the 20th century, it's been increasing the number of people, civilians,
Yes,
who have been
it's-
killed in the
today it's
war-making
mostly
process,
civilians.
mostly Dresden and this kind of thing
Yes.
that was done, not to mention Hiroshima and
Yeah.
other kinds of things where
Well,
the
and of
civilians...
course the Nazi atrocities
And that's
during
what I
the
wanted
war,
to ask you. What role did it play, and what was the precedent setting, if it was, role of the Nuremberg trials following the Second War by us?
I would say that what happened in World War II is really what inspired first the formation of the United Nations itself, but also the adoption of all of the human rights agreements that come out of the formation of the United Nations.
You think that's the case, right? It was,
Yes, because before that...
the League had failed.
Before that, it was largely agreed that whatever happened within a country was the business of that country.
Sovereignty?
That sovereignty was of such significance that the only way you could protect rights was to do it within a country.
Yeah.
And so we had various agreements that were of a national character that protected rights. We had the English Declaration of Rights of 1689. We had the French Declaration of Rights of 1689. We had the American Declaration of Independence, and then the U.S. Bill of Rights in 1791. But these were all on a national basis, and it was believed that because you were a citizen of a particular country which had an agreement on rights, you enjoyed rights by means of your citizenship.
Yes. Right.
And then after World War II, after the Nazi atrocities, and after the Japanese atrocities during World War II.
Perhaps in a degree, don't let us not forget that there was something on the order of 20 to 25 million Russian people killed in that war, starvation, and the just stark horror of modern war with the incredible weaponry coming along and the destructive capabilities.
The Japanese also engaged in great atrocities. Perhaps 10 million people were killed by the Japanese during World War II.
So many.
If you include all those in China and the Philippines and other parts of Asia, it was probably about 10 million. It was only that the atrocities of Europe seem even larger than the atrocities by the Japanese, which sometimes make us forget the scale of the crimes committed during World War II. At any rate,
but the horror, the horror of the modern era
made people generally take the view that it was no longer appropriate to say that whatever a country did within its own borders was its own business, that there had to be a wider protection of rights, and that indeed everybody had an interest in protecting rights. And so that's really what gave rise to the human rights provisions of the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
And trying to get some Universal Declaration of Human Rights apart from, in a certain sense,
it
sovereignty.
It meant that it's your humanity that gives you the right to protection, not just your citizenship.
Exactly right. And they're trying to get at some sort of universal principles that could be agreed upon and so forth.
And that's largely accepted today. I mean,
and
various times.
And that's evolving.
It is evolving, and various times you have countries that still like to say that it's an interference in sovereignty for other countries to be concerned with rights,
and that they will say there's different cultural standards and so forth.
And that has happened, for instance, in recent years in different parts of Asia. China and Malaysia and Singapore and Indonesia under Suharto took the position that there are Asian cultural values. And the effort to promote human rights, they said, was inappropriate because it represented Western ideas that come into conflict with Asian cultural values.
Well, when we live in a world where we do have, as the French called us, a hyperpower, and the West has had a tremendous influence in the modern experience, that's something one can be aware of. But sometimes those cultural values go over into trying to inform economic policy and so forth. So it's one of the major bones of contention as we begin to look out at the world as a whole.
It's always worth bearing in mind that it is the governments of those countries which talk about those cultural values and talk about rights being in conflict with those cultural values. The people who actually try to exercise rights have a different point of view.
Real human rights other than currency trading or valuations of a certain way of, and that sort of thing. And it's all evolving quickly. So we're going through a very rapid rapid time. It's
We
like
have been
war
quite
isn't that
thorough.
far off. I mean, in a certain sense, in the longer sweep of human history, and things are evolving from where the sovereignty residing at the, it still resides at the nation state. We still
It resides in the nation state, but we have come to recognize that there are certain things that limit sovereignty, that, for example, a government cannot commit genocide against its own people.
What was that went on in Burundi?
Well,
what was that
Burundi
that
and Rwanda have been genocides, but for instance, the architects of the genocide in Rwanda are now being tried before an international criminal tribunal, and a number of them have been convicted.
And you, if I may, I suggest, and we also have this international criminal court
that's
before the world
being,
opinion now and so forth and being found. And you've had a considerable interest in the development of those institutions.
Yes.
And we've had, if we may, The Hague. The International Court of Justice is, after all, the third leg of the United Nations systems itself. And where does that fit in and so forth? And then particularly bring it up, maybe if you could, to the International Court of Justice and to the courts of justice to deal with war crimes that have been committed against humanity, and I think you've had an interest in
Right. The International Court of Justice is an older institution, and it exists to try cases that involve differences between states, so that if a state disputes a boundary with another state, it can bring a claim before the International Court of Justice. It is not a court that can impose criminal punishments.
They have to submit to it. The nation does.
And after the war crimes tribunals at Nuremberg and at Tokyo after World War II, there was no international criminal court until the establishment in 1993
just happening
of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia.
And that's only just finally been ratified by 60?
Well, no, that's the International Court.
Trying to keep our court straight.
There's the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia.
All right, yes.
That was established in 1993, and then the following year, an International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda.
Now, the former is where Mr. Milosevic is now?
Yes,
right.
That's right. Those are called ad hoc tribunals. They're ad hoc because they deal with a particular circumstance. And now the International Criminal Court has been ratified, and it would be a permanent body, not an ad hoc body, and it would operate on a worldwide basis. It required 60 countries to ratify it.
They just did it.
On April 11, 66 ratified. That is, there had been 56 before then, and then in one day, 10 more ratified, and now it's 67 that have ratified. I would say in a year probably about 80 or maybe even 85 countries will have ratified the statute.
And encouraging development in the march of human affairs?
I think so,
you do,
because
you've helped in that
I've been
in
very
terms of getting that involved. And we wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, no, I was particularly involved in creating the tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. That is, I issued the first call for it that got taken seriously. And
when would that have been?
Well, in 1992, when I was still executive director of Human Rights Watch. We issued a report on war crimes in Bosnia. We issued it in July 1992, and writing the material for that report, I issued a call for a war crimes tribunal, and it happened...
You were the first?
Yes, it happened that the call was issued just as the story was breaking on the death camps that the Serbs operated in Bosnia. And
those photographs were hitting the media.
Right. And so people were looking for a way of responding to the reports on the death camps. And so the call for a tribunal happened to come at a moment when people were ready to listen to a call of that sort. And so I think that's the reason that the call got taken seriously. And then the following October, the United Nations established a War Crimes Commission to collect evidence. And then in December, Secretary of State Larry Eagleburger added his voice to the call for a tribunal. And then the following February...
That was for the tribunal.
Yes, and then the following February, the United Nations authorized the Secretary General to draft a plan for a tribunal, and then in May 1993, the UN actually created the tribunal.
Okay, and was it going parallel with the development of the International Criminal Court?
Well, the effort to create the International Criminal Court had been sort of on ice for a long time. There had been
10 years or no?
There had been a
20, 30,
initial plan, even at the time of Nuremberg, for a permanent International Criminal Court. And then the Cold War made it impossible.
Okay.
And then it got started in a way which wouldn't have gotten anywhere. That is, Trinidad and Tobago called for an International Criminal Court, and they were concerned with drug crimes at that moment. But because of the Yugoslavia Tribunal and the Rwanda Tribunal, there was more momentum, there was more impetus.
That's the way these things happen.
And then it culminated in a conference in Rome in 1998. And at that Rome conference, 120 countries approved the call for a permanent International Criminal Court. And then after that, it was necessary to ratify a treaty that had been drafted, and that ratification just completed in April. So now the court is in the process of being created.
All right, okay, that's good. That's really good. It's really a summary of the things development that's in the works now, and you've had a hand in that. I'm glad to do that. I wonder maybe we could, in certain, and maybe we could, I don't know if it's right or wrong, we could go maybe parenthetically a little bit, because the United States, there's serious forces here in the United States and other parts, other sovereign entities around the world that are in opposition to that idea. But I wonder if maybe we could begin to maybe have that in our mind, but segue over to the Open Society Institute, because you're president of that and have been. You see a continuation of the Human Rights Watch work and the charge of the Open Society Institute. Maybe you could share a little bit the Open Society Institute.
Sure.
Maybe some of Karl Popper's visions that are inspiring.
The Open Society Institute is the foundation established by George Soros to promote open societies worldwide.
And what do we mean by that, if we could?
Well, an open society is one where no one is seen to have a monopoly on the truth. Everybody, therefore, is able to participate in a discussion of how to improve the society.
Marketplace of ideas.
And we recognize that there are imperfections in every society, and so when society opens, it improves. So that over time, the rule of law can prevail, that over time, a society can treat all its people in some decent way. People are not held back because they are of a particular race or religion. All of those are elements of an open society, and also one with a market economy.
There are a lot of things are included in that, aren't there? And that sort of thing. And some of the work of Karl Popper, you say that the rule of law is an important one. We want to see that being able to evolve, and so it's sort of like the idea of synergy. It's like a thing where you've got a behavior of systems unpredicted by the sum of the parts, and it would seem to be against the notion of some fundamentalist kind of notion of absolute truth that encompasses and subsumes everything else. It's the danger of totalitarian systems under whatever name it is. But the idea of the rule of law is an important one, and that's a we're going to universal principle. That's a sort of universal principle that the rule of law rather than arbitrary authority is something that's to be encouraged, and that's a value that should be discussed by people who are interested in improving the human condition.
And part of what we do in the Open Society Institute is to try to promote the rule of law.
And to have the law make more and cogent sense as we move with the times and be able to, my father was a lawyer. He used to talk about the philosophy of the law and that sort of thing. I mean, the law can be an ass, and the law can be a source of great oppression. I mean, Hitler was voted into power in 1933, was voted in an election, and he used the law in order to do some of it. We had Mr. McCarthy, who got pretty far down the line and so forth. within the current context of the law. So you understand that's the tension.
Including legal power can be abused, and there have to be checks on all power, because once it's concentrated, the likelihood of its abuse grows.
Do you see a distinction between, let's say, in the realm of state power? State power is the ability of a legislative government that can enact and enforce law and that sort of thing, and then economic power. And is there a difference between that? You have political power and you have economic power. Do they go hand in hand? Can you have a plutocracy, let's say ownership, or even in the name of private property or something, owned by a very few? There are some countries in South America where the 12, 15 families own, or something like that, and still have democracy flourish. Can you have a political democracy with an economic plutocracy? Do the two things go hand in hand, economic democracy?
You can
is that a problem on a world scale?
Yeah, you can certainly have concentrations of economic power, but my own view is that there have to be checks on every kind of power. There needs to be a certain amount of regulation of economic power in order to be sure that abuses don't take place. For example, economic power can be used to create monopolies, to control prices, to make free trade impossible. So economic power can be used to defeat economic, or even economic development can be frustrated by too great a concentration of economic power.
Do you think we have too much of a concentration of economic power in the world now? Let's see, this is the year 2002. And if we look at it on the large scale, there's some figures that there's 253 people whose net worth is worth something like close on to 50% of the world population or something, and the differences are growing. And is that an important question or not?
I think it is an important question.
Okay.
I'm not one who argues that we need to have a leveling of economic power.
We need to have some growth.
We need to have some growth, and we need certain capital concentrations in order to promote growth. But at the same time, I do think it's scandalous that so many people have so little in the way of economic resources. That there has to be some greater distribution of economic resources to lift up the people who are at the very bottom of the economic scale. When people live on less than $1 a day, or less than,
how can they do that? I mean,
with great difficulty, obviously. Obviously.
And it's a weight upon their conscience. It's hard to overcome.
There's no possibility for people like that of lifting themselves up by their own bootstraps. So I think we need to get a larger number of people to the point that they can better their own circumstances.
And one of the charges of the Open Society is to try and encourage that?
Well, we do try to encourage that, and we engage in a certain number of economic development programs in order to try to benefit people who are at the very bottom end of the economic spectrum.
And I know Mr. Soros has been, as have I, by Karl Popper, and the idea of the philosophy that's behind that. Has it been informed, or is this Open Society informed by a particular economic philosophy? Are they inspired by, or economic theory? Are they inspired by Hayek, Mr. Schumpeter with his ideas of creative entrepreneurialism? Is it Mr. Friedman? Do we have an economic theory that can inform the international process of globalization that we can take a certain sense of, I heard you say open market, we want that,
I wouldn't
but that
say,
we can say is in place, or is there a need for change?
I wouldn't say that there is one economic theory that...
are there principles that we can come to, maybe like in the case of international law?
Well, I would say that I would say that there are certain principles. On the one hand, markets work, and markets do promote economic progress. On the other hand, markets are not infallible. They're highly fallible, and markets can lead to excessive concentration of economic power. So there have to be certain mechanisms to regulate markets and to limit concentrations on economic power. Now, that's very general.
Yeah, that is general.
And there are many economic theories that can fit into that. So I don't want to espouse one economic theory.
Maybe in the keeping of the open society principle, we don't have one. They used to do that in the name of Marxism. And there's still people who do say that that's absolute. Marxism had an absolutely scientific basis to understanding the inevitable unfolding of history and so forth.
I don't think it does.
No. But is there on the other side?
I don't think there is.
There is not.
There are people one could call market fundamentalists who believe that markets...
Friedman?
Friedman comes close to being a market fundamentalist.
And he's pretty much followed by a lot of influential people, particularly now, isn't it?
Yes. I mean,
and that would be the model that is sort of being put out as
I have a great deal of respect for Friedman as an economist, but I don't agree with him.
You do not? Okay,
no.
Fair enough. But he's very much influencing particularly the neocons and that kind of thing, who are sort of in the saddle
I would say
now.
that some of the disciples of Friedman go to a point where Friedman himself might not go.
Well, that would be an interesting... that would be an interesting event. But we have but anyway, I didn't mean to get astray, but the economic question is an important one, particularly at a practical, everyday level of, abstract rights that people have. But the economic one, if they can't put food on the children's plate, it's very hard for them to think about something else, isn't it, for a great number of the world?
And I think that all of us need to be concerned about that.
Absolutely. And the trend is worrying in the parts of some. I saw Mr. Sachs, Jeffrey Sachs, on this program the other day, and he said it works well. Globalization works really well for about 1/6 of the population of the world. But the trends for a great number of those others are going in a disquieting pattern, and one can't help to think, but some of the blowback, like kind of response that we got on 9/11 and from other sources around the world might be coming from
I'm not sure I attribute 9/11 to
no, I didn't want to do it directly,
to economic inequality, because the people who were directly involved in 9/11
doing very well,
were doing quite well. They came from middle class backgrounds, and their hatred of the United States wasn't, I think, based on identification with the poor. I think terrorism is a separate question. I think we ought to be concerned with the poor, not because of terrorism. We ought to be concerned with the poor because
it's a human right.
It's human decency, I would say.
And also we have such an incredibly evolving, technologically augmented capability of providing that we have not had historically.
But technology is also separating us more and more from the poor. There are those who get the benefits of technology, and then those who are left aside by technology.
And that could amplify the old dictum that those that have get?
Well, I think that's the way it's working.
That's the way it's working. And the trend is picking up, so the inequality isn't growing?
I think it's what's referred to as the digital divide.
That's a digital divide, and the digital divide is an economic divide as well, because there's opportunity. And that's a major problem that should be somehow confronted at a macroeconomic level or something. But I'm sorry, I didn't get a feel. But the Open Society, when did it get started, and what are some of the parameters? I know you've done a great deal in Eastern Europe.
Right.
And that sort of thing. Maybe you could share with us.
George Soros started what he called initially the Open Society Fund in 1979, and he began work in South Africa, and he began funding scholarships for blacks to attend a predominantly white university, the University of Cape Town. And then it got going in Eastern Europe in 1984 with the establishment of a foundation in Hungary while the communist system was still in place.
In what year, I'm sorry?
84.
84.
And he felt at that time that there were contradictions in the communist system that one could exploit, and that communism wasn't necessarily forever. And that proved to be the case.
5 years off,
And after 1989, after the revolutions of 1989 transformed that region, he established foundations throughout that region. And those foundations tried to take advantage of a revolutionary moment, the end of communism, to promote open societies. And it succeeded in some measure and failed in some measure. It tended to succeed in the countries which had traditions that one could build upon, such as those in Central Europe. On the other hand, those in Central Asia had no tradition of democracy or open society, and it's been very difficult in that region to move them towards open societies. But we've worked in that region during this period since the fall of communism, and then in more recent years we've expanded to much of Africa, to some parts of Southeast Asia, to a few countries in Latin America, and to a small degree to the Middle East, trying to build open societies on a more global basis.
And I want to back off. He said in 1984. He was.
Right.
Was he prescient then? I know one of the things that alarmed a great number of people is we had the CIA and we had our intelligence services, and it's just coming to the surface now about 9/11 and so forth. But we had that, and we had these developments, and the developments, and they missed, in a certain sense. Our intelligence services missed the coming downfall, the implosion of the Soviet Union, the biggest story in the history that was before us. And Mr. Soros was prescient in that? Or I was going to ask you at a personal level, were you of that thought that the Soviet Union was about to implode, say, in 1984 or so forth, or not? Or the general intellectual
I wouldn't say
community?
that I thought it was about to implode.
No, but did it catch us all by surprise?
Yes, I think it did.
A change of such
I
dimension.
think it did. I
Why?
don't think any of us anticipated that it could happen so quickly.
Right.
That once the fall started,
Yeah.
we didn't know that it would take place
Why
almost
did it catch
overnight.
us all by such surprise, do you think? Or is there anything to be learned from about the forward thrust?
Because
We're at this,
I suppose...
I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'm just thinking off the top
I
of my
think
head.
there are many different reasons, but as part of the whole Cold War period, we worried a great deal about the strength of the Soviet Union and of the countries in the Soviet bloc.
Absolutely.
And I don't think we saw the internal rot. I don't think we realized how many weak points there were and how deeply unpopular those regimes were.
Systemically flawed, almost philosophically and
those countries, those states were weaker than we knew, because we had to defend ourselves against them. And therefore we had to be concerned with their strength. And I think our preoccupation with their strength prevented us from seeing their weakness.
Just that'd be the intellectual community.
I think so.
We didn't catch it. It's just interesting that would have been the case. We had a bipolar world for all those years. Remember MAD?
Yes,
I can remember getting under the desk, actually getting
No,
under the desk with duck and cover.
I can recall
and
that.
it was there, and we're still with these. I mean, we're beginning to. Do you think the atomic bulletin, the bulletin of atomic science, just put the clock up to 7 minutes to 0? And what do you think in terms of that, which we used to follow over these last decades, the threat of the destructive capability of our technology might be unleashed in some sort of a tremendous... what is your general... do you think we're over the hill? Do you think we're okay?
Not completely.
No.
Because
is there still a danger of a mass annihilation?
We have, at this moment, the danger of conflict between two nuclear powers, India and Pakistan.
It's very frightening.
That's a disturbing thing.
It certainly is. And it could trigger, like, remember Guns of August? And that got started with the assassination.
I don't think it will.
You think not? You think less? You feel more sanguine than you did before the fall?
Yes, because it is the case that the United States is the only superpower.
French call us a hyperpower.
Yes, but they also refer to hypermarkets.
Oh, I see. Well, that's the French too, right? They got to be.
That's their terminology.
Oh, I see.
They use hyper where we use super. That's just the phrasing.
Okay, good.
So I don't think.
But you know what I mean?
Sure.
Yeah, and it's a new Rome on the Potomac or something people see and that kind of thing. And then they would say, is there some flaw that we have?
Yeah,
or can we be complacent that we're okay? We got everything together, our system is fine?
I think the danger
You know
to
what I'm
us
saying?
at this
Is
moment...
there a problem of hubris on our part?
Well, yes, I mean, September 11 demonstrated that.
Did it, or was that...
In this respect, that we thought that military power would protect us, and here were these technologically primitive people with box cutters,
and a great deal of hatred.
And they inflicted enormous damage on us.
Physically and psychically, I
absolutely.
think. Yeah.
And I don't think we can say we're completely protected against a repetition of that. We've probably protected ourselves against an exact repetition. It's probably difficult to or more difficult to hijack planes and use them as missiles than it was before September 11.
I would have thought. It's usually like letting the horse out of the barn.
But when you think of all of the ways in which people can engage in terrorist acts, you can't really take comfort that we're protected.
And the avenue, long-term avenue toward trying to perhaps protect ourselves, if that's the case, or the human society, or the future. We both got young grandchildren now, so you begin to think generationally. It's hard to imagine anything that's more important in the long term toward that than trying to get at some agreements of what is, well, let's say, justice and so forth, and the prospect or the ideas of what is called an open society as a almost universal principles that come to be agreed upon and encouraged on the world scale.
I think we have a self-interest in promoting open societies.
And to get at the definition of what we mean by that, including all the cultural differences. It's a great challenge for the both politically, sociologically, and economically. And that's what this open society is concerned with, do you think?
Well,
you feel that way?
We're promoting open societies for their own sake. Certainly when we started promoting open societies, we didn't think of them as the alternative to terrorism. But I would say that I don't think the kinds of people who engage in terrorist acts are produced by open societies. I think they tend to be produced by repressive societies. I think they tend to be people who are driven by hatreds, by people who are responding to
injustice?
No, I would really say authoritarian systems that produce a kind of reaction that is itself somewhat the mirror image of the authoritarianism that they know, that they want to impose their ideas on the rest of us, and they come from societies which are intent on imposing their own ideas on those persons.
And perhaps have accepted a dialectic where whoever wins cuts the heads off the people who lose, with guillotines and things like that, like the reign of terror, and you know, and that sort of thing.
I don't think we can.
We have to get past that.
I don't think we can
protect
ourselves completely against terrorism as long as we have regimes that practice terror, and we do have those regimes in a good part of the world. I think we've got to overcome some of these authoritarian systems, which seem to me to be breeding grounds for people who committed the acts of the sort that took place on September 11.
We have somewhat of a historical problem with this, in a sense. We were at a conference recently, or you were, I was in the audience, you were participating on the stage very aptly, and thank you for that, but it was at the New School University on terrorism and so forth. And we have a problem. The UN itself, which is an international body, hasn't been able to come up with a definition yet of terrorism. I just do that. They had a conference out in Malaysia the other day, and the Islamic states couldn't come up with the definition of it. I went to the George Polk Award, who followed journalism and so forth, and they had a fellow from the BBC, one from the Wall Street Journal, one from the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal guy was just clear, we know exactly what a terrorist is, and the BBC won't use the word. They can't use the word on the BBC reporting because, as he reported, they've learned over a long experience that today's terrorist is tomorrow's prime minister. and terrorist was a term used against Nelson Mandela. I believe George III called George Washington a terrorist, and it's a term that's used by people that are in power against the people who are going to try and confront them
I
in
must
what is
say,
called a freedom struggle.
I must say that in those circumstances, I think I'd be on the side of those who say you can define it. I would say that if
you would have called Mandela a terrorist?
No, I wouldn't have called Mandela.
Or George Washington?
No, I wouldn't have.
No.
George Washington didn't go and kill non-combatants in order to impose his views on anybody else. He did lead a revolution, but a revolution in which you are trying to overthrow a government, but the means you use are not the means of terrorism. I think terrorism is all about the means.
The means, you do. It does have that to it. Was the, I don't mean to, but like I know a few years ago I was very much in opposition to our involvement in Vietnam, and I got very upset when I realized that there was napalm dropped upon civilians in great number and arbitrarily, and it sounded awfully like terrorism to me, being enacted in the government representing my name. Is that terrorism? Well, and was the dropping, I understand from what I heard that Hiroshima had very few military targets. Was that an act of terrorism? Was Dresden an act of terrorism? So does it become so widespread, the human violations, that the word begins to lose its meaning, or does it?
It's possible. I mean, you could use the word or the term war crimes. That is, if you engage in attacks on civilians that are either targeted attacks on civilians or you kill civilians indiscriminately.
Which the nations have done in this century with great alacrity.
And the British and we did at Dresden, for example.
But we're never put in the dock.
No,
because we were the winners, right?
We were the winners.
You understand?
Yes.
Now, is that good enough standard by which the world's going to be
operating? I don't think so.
And is that why the United States is objecting to the International Criminal Court?
Well,
they might be put in the dock?
I think the United States is objecting in a somewhat paranoid way to the because I think the United States has actually become quite careful in the way it conducts war. If you look at the way we conducted the Kosovo War,
amazing.
But we were also very careful not to engage in war crimes. We never targeted civilians. We went after military targets exclusively. We made some mistakes, but everybody makes mistakes.
Is that a luxury that's given only to the ones who are in power? Rome could do that, but people who are... I remember Hitler was in the Balkans, and he called the partisans of Yugoslavia terrorists. But he had the army and say, why don't you fight us like a good upstanding army? Or I don't want to go back to Lexington and Concord where people are fighting guerrilla.
I think anybody who engages in combat ought to limit the way in which they engage in combat in a manner that does not involve them in committing war crimes. That is, it's one thing to attack the enemy. It's another thing to attack people who are not combatants in order to terrorize others and that way to try to prevail. That's when you engage in terrorism.
Thank you for the criminal court and for the World Tribunal and that sort of thing that's happened. We've had a century where that has been this century has been where that, we just said the human non-combatants were the increased casualties of the war. There was a point where we reached that which was a crescendo, and we're now moving away from that.
I think
as
so.
a historical trend.
I think so. In Kosovo,
and the courts to support
in Kosovo and in Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, again, we made mistakes, but at least so far as our targets were concerned, we aimed for military targets, and the care that we took in both the Kosovo War and the Afghanistan War to do that means to me that the United States is now trying to avoid engaging in war crimes, and if you make mistakes, that's not a war crime.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, and that's a completely different thing.
Yes,
and it's encouraging then, in a sense that
we
reached a crescendo of destroying civilians, like with Dresden and so forth, and it was done, or Hiroshima.
Yes.
And somehow we've come away from that.
I think we've come a long way away from that.
Trend that
Kosovo and Afghanistan are a long way from Vietnam.
Kosovo I see, even from Vietnam.
I believe so.
We crossed some sort of a
I
divide
believe so.
then, and there might be hope taken in that.
I
and to have
can't-
the legal structure that
I
you've been
can't
involved in, I
imagine-
congratulate you
I
on
can't
that.
imagine us using napalm today the way we did in Vietnam. I cannot imagine it.
It was a horror. It was a horror, yeah, it was done. And so James Joyce, my favorite line, James Joyce said, history is a nightmare in which I'm attempting to awaken. Do you think we're awakening? Are we...
I think we've
is there
become
still a
much more
danger?
conscious
Are you
of...
less angst-ridden about the human condition than you would have been 20 years ago?
Oh, I don't know about that. That's a...
That's a biggie. Huh?
That's a big question.
Yeah.
And then we're not talking only about the United States.
No.
We're talking about the whole world.
Yes. Well, we live in
And,
an interconnected world, don't we?
There are plenty of reasons for angst today. So I don't know that I'm less ridden by angst than 20
One
years
big
ago.
one that got us, though, was that we had these destructive capabilities. I did Joshua letter where one time he said, we have the ability to destroy the species.
We
After
do.
200,000 years of
Yeah.
human history. That was a big... Do you think we're getting away from that?
I hope so.
Yeah,
I
but your
hope
sense
so.
is. And if there's anything that's encouraging, that would be the kind of things that you think you're doing at the Open Society.
I think gradually the rule of law is
Rule
at
of law
least
is
being
important.
accepted in principle,
Yeah.
and it's being accepted in practice in certain parts of the world. We've got a long way to go.
You have a long way to go, and but we have increased numbers of institutions, some of which I
Yes.
congratulate you on having helped put in place from the human rights thing that is becoming able to be more and more accepted. One last thing, maybe we're just running out of time, sorry, but there's an important role for the media and the liaison between yourselves and the media who can help, because the television and the media is increasingly important in terms of alchemy by which people can have an understanding of these things.
Well, I think the
Education
media
really is.
are crucial.
Yeah.
Without the media, we don't have any way of maintaining control of government. The media
I
are our
see.
mechanism for exercising control, because as we gain information, we're able to actually affect the way governments operate. Without the information, it's impossible.
Yeah, but getting the information, and also letting the people have the information so there can be a little political
Well,
pressure put to move things along.
if the media are aggressive, if the media ask a lot
free,
of questions,
and
are
they're not
free,
muzzled,
and if they're
that's all.
diverse, then I think we have a good chance of controlling our governments.
All right, good. Well, I'm sorry we run out
Thank
of
you.
time. Pleasure.
Okay,
Your
I've
pleasure. I have
enjoyed
the
it.
perception we're right out of time. Aryeh Neier, then he's the president of the Open Society Institute. Happy to have been able to bring you those perceptions. We're in conversations. Invite you to tune in. We'll be coming back again next week. That's one, but once again, I'd like to thank you really very much for
Thank
coming
you.
in. We just started scratching the surface of an interconnected set of circumstances, but happy to welcome you to public access television.
Thank you.
We'll see you next week. So these things all sort of interconnect, you know, it seems to me. And I really thank you for that work and putting that structure, and helping to put that structure in place for bringing some consequence to what are really war crimes, you know. That's important, you know.
It was very satisfying work.
I should think. It still goes on. I mean, that goes on.
Yeah.
And that's part of what you do now
Yes.
at the Institute. You have
Yeah.
to take other things into
Yeah.
account and everything like that. Well, it's an important source of hope in terms of the world. I get sometimes worried. I hope you're really right about that. I hadn't realized it, that we've